What exactly happened to the great kingdoms and empires in Nigeria during the scramble for Africa? But first, what was happening in this region before that period? As you will see, by the 16th century, the territory that now constitutes Nigeria was a collection of distinct, powerful, and prosperous kingdoms and empires. But in the late 1800s, a series of devastating events occurred to each of these empires. These events are usually narrated to justify the actions of the invaders. But there's much more to the stories. In my years of research into African history of this period, nothing else reveals the malevolent intention of colonialism as the attacks on kingdoms and empires. I created a map of Nigeria that shows the dates of the collapse of each kingdom due to the so-called punitive expeditions and an approximation of their territorial extent in the late 1880s. I'll put the link to its free download below. And please, remember to subscribe for more videos on African history. I'll start with what was happening in the Nigerian kingdoms and empires between the 16th and 18th century, and then highlight several of the British military campaigns that led to their collapse. By 1500 AD, the kingdoms and empires in the Nigerian region had marked their territories, usually by means of war. Some, as with the case of Oyo Empire, extended beyond the borders of present Nigeria. The Oyo Empire, by backtracking its chronology, is estimated to have been established around 1300. What we know for sure is that by 1400, Oyo had emerged as a Yoruba state, and it was growing in power. It grew wealthy as a result of trade with the house estates to its north and the Portuguese vessels that plied the coast of West Africa to its south. Oyo also expanded at the expense of its neighbors, and in the early 16th century, its border extended to what is now Benin Republic. Although there was a period of about 80 years when Oyo was occupied by the Nupe Kingdom, which attacked and conquered Oyo by use of cavalry around 1535. Learning from this defeat, Oyo acquired horses and developed its own cavalry. In 1610, aided by its now renowned cavalry warriors and archers, Oyo wrestled back its territory from the Nupe Kingdom and embarked on a period of territorial expansion. At its height in the 18th century, Oyo's territory encompassed parts of Nupe and Bornu kingdoms to its north, and to its south, Dahomey, in present Benin Republic, Owu, Ketu, and several other rival kingdoms. Because of Oyo's expansion, it gained control of regional trade routes and grew rich from trading in salt, gold, and slaves. Yes, slaves! As a result of Oyo's numerous conquests by its seemingly invincible cavalry warriors, it had an abundance of war captives, and it became a major participant in the lucrative slave trade. So much so that by the 18th century, the West African coastal area controlled by the Oyo Empire, Kingdom of Dahomey, and Benin Kingdom was known as the Slave Coast. While Oyo was at the height of its power, just to its east, the Kingdom of Benin was already in decline, severely weakened by civil wars and a series of conflicts over succession. The Benin Kingdom, established in the 12th century, was the successor to the Edo Kingdom of Igbo Domigodo, a kingdom that oral history traces back to 40 BCE. Benin began its historic expansion in the 15th century during the reign of the warrior king, Hewuhare the Great, who was considered the greatest ruler of the kingdom. Oba Hewuhare began Benin Kingdom's imperial era. He expanded Benin territory and influence through military conquests and maintained dominance over these regions. Hewuhare extended the walls and moats surrounding Benin, and under him, the kingdom experienced a renaissance of the arts for which it is now acclaimed. When the Dutch geographer Alfred Dapper visited Benin in the early 1600s, he described the royal palace as having beautiful and long square galleries about as big as the Exchange at Amsterdam, some bigger than others, resting on wooden pillars, covered from top to bottom with cast copper, on which deeds of war and battle scenes are carved. At its height in the 16th century, Benin stretched beyond the river Niger in the east and extended west as far as present-day Ghana. Benin prospered as a result of regional trade. It acted as a middleman for other kingdoms even before European contact. There's evidence that cowrie shells, which came via Persia, were used as a currency in Benin before the 13th century. This points to trade with northern African savanna kingdoms. From the 15th century, Benin carried on an active trade in ivory, palm oil, and pepper with Portuguese and Dutch traders. Benin was also involved in the West African slave trade, and this was a significant source of wealth for the kingdom during the 16th and 17th centuries. Before these centuries, in circa 15th century, the cradle of Yoruba civilization, the Kingdom of Ife, had virtually disappeared. The Kingdom of Ife, the first known organized forest kingdom, had grown to become a large walled city with several large stone buildings by the 11th century. By the late 12th century, its artisans were producing naturalistic terracotta heads and bronze pieces. And in the 14th century, Ife, its capital, was one of the largest urban centers in West Africa. Ife was also one of the oldest trading empires in West Africa. It participated in the trans-Saharan trade and was connected to the camel caravan trade routes that crossed the Sahara and reached such cities as Tripoli on the Mediterranean coast. Although Ife's cultural and economical influence spread as far as Togo, Ife wasn't as imperialistic as other West African empires. Ife Kingdom's demise in the early 15th century has been attributed to several factors: civil wars, political disturbances in western Sudan, and an epidemic. Furthermore, a group of rock carvings found in Ife indicates that it was probably dealing with Islamic expansions into its territory in the late 14th century. This is conceivable as records show that the Hausa kingdoms made frequent raids against the various people to their south, and in the early 19th century, the kingdom's successor, the Sokoto Caliphate, would conquer the Yoruba town of Ilorin. The Hausa kingdoms emerged in the 10th century as a group of small independent city-states in what is today northern Nigeria. By 1500, they had created several walled towns, containing traditional Hausa houses made from dried mud bricks, and were flourishing. Islam had taken root in the kingdoms, and some of the kingdoms by this time were ruled by Muslim clerics. Kano especially had become a center of Islamic scholarship with scholars brought in from Egypt, Tunis, and Morocco. The Hausa kingdoms prospered as a result of local and regional trade. They traded in salt, precious metals, and leather goods, becoming famous for their finely worked leather goods such as water bags, saddles, and sacks to transport goods for the trade caravans. The kingdoms traded with the coastal region of West Africa, including Oyo and the Bida of Benin, and the Songhai Empire to the east. At some point, slaves became an important source of revenue for the Hausa kingdoms, and they specialized in acquiring slaves via raids to the south. In the late 18th century, the Fulani, nomadic cattle herders who had earlier settled in Hausaland, launched a religious war in the region. And by 1808, all the Hausa kingdoms had been conquered by a mix of Fulani warriors and Hausa peasants headed by Usman Dan Fodio and incorporated into the Sokoto Caliphate. It was a different story for the Bornu Empire. The Bornu Empire, also known as the Kanem-Bornu Empire, emerged from the Kanem Empire. The Kanem Empire, located in modern-day Chad and ruled by the Safavid dynasty, flourished between the 9th and 14th century. By the 13th century, Kanem was already a powerful Muslim kingdom, but around 1380, Kanem was attacked and taken over by the Bulala, a warrior tribe in Chad. The ruler of Kanem at the time, Umar Idris, fled with his people to Bornu on the western edge of Lake Chad. The new Bornu Empire grew steadily, and in the late 1500s, it reached its height under the leadership of Idris Oluma. He successfully consolidated the empire, expanded its territories, and promoted a strong military presence. Bornu grew to control both sides of Lake Chad by eventually taking over the old Kanem territory. Islam continued to be the dominant religion, and Idris Oluma engaged in diplomatic relations with other Islamic powers, such as the Ottoman Empire. After the death of Idris Oluma in the early 17th century, the empire began to face internal strife and regional rivalries, which diminished its power. During this period, Bornu Empire was also facing external threats, especially from nomadic groups like the Tuareg and other Berber tribes. By the 18th century, the empire had fragmented into smaller regional kingdoms that often fought each other for control and resources. The rise of the Sokoto Caliphate in the early 19th century led to increased pressure on Bornu. The empire managed to resist Sokoto influence to a degree, but the region was being reshaped by the jihadist movement. Another kingdom that was weakened by the emergence of a powerful polity in its region is the Kingdom of Nri in what is now southeastern Nigeria. The Kingdom of Nri was one of the most influential Igbo civilizations. Unlike many African kingdoms that thrived on military conquests, Nri's power was based on religious or ritual authority, making it a unique kingdom in African history. By 1500, Nri was at the peak of its power. The king priest of Nri wielded immense religious and judicial influence over many Igbo communities, including Igbo settlements on the west bank of the Niger and communities affected by the Benin Empire. Nri was also a hub for trade, particularly in yam, ivory, and crafts. It maintained diplomatic relations with neighbors, including the Benin Kingdom, and avoided direct involvement in warfare. But in the 18th century, as European influences grew in West Africa, the Kingdom of Nri began to face serious challenges. A major one had to do with the transatlantic slave trade. While many Igbo communities participated in the slave trade, Nri was one of the very few that opposed slavery. As slave trading states like Arochukwu and the Benin Kingdom grew wealthier and more powerful, Nri's non-participation weakened its political influence. And by the 19th century, the expansionist Aro Confederacy, backed by their oracle Ibni Aparbi, began to dominate Igbo affairs, further weakening Nri's authority. This brings us to one of the last kingdoms to be established in Nigeria, the Aro Confederacy. Not far from the Kingdom of Nri, the Aro Confederacy emerged in what is now southeastern Nigeria in the 17th century. The Confederacy was not a kingdom in the traditional sense, but rather a loose political and religious coalition of various towns and villages who had aligned themselves with the Aro oracle. Thus, the Confederacy's roots can be traced back to when the Aro people, who belonged to the Igbo ethnic group, established a powerful oracle at the sacred city of Arochukwu. This oracle, known as Ibni Aparbi, became central to the Confederacy's rise to power. By the 18th century, the Aro Confederacy had become one of the most powerful entities in the region. It had built a formidable army. This military force, though not as large as some neighboring kingdoms, was known for its strategic raids and efficiency in expanding Aro's dominance over other Igbo communities. But it's said that the Aro Confederacy's influence expanded largely due to its religious authority. Many surrounding communities, from the Nsukka region to parts of Yoruba lands, began to consult the Ibni Aparbi oracle for political legitimacy. In return, Aro provided spiritual guidance, as well as protection and military assistance. By the early 19th century, the Aro Confederacy had consolidated significant power over southeastern Nigeria. It established a system of trade and politics in which many local rulers and villages came under the influence of Aro. It also established a reputation as a major participant in the transatlantic slave trade. Aro merchants acted as middlemen in the trade, capturing and selling slaves to European traders in exchange for goods like firearms, textiles, and alcohol. The Confederacy's involvement in the slave trade gave it considerable wealth, which strengthened its military and diplomatic influence. In the mid-19th century, however, the Confederacy began to face challenges. The British and other European powers sought to weaken Aro's influence and increase their own control in the region. Additionally, the Aro Confederacy had begun to encounter resistance from other local powers, including the Efik Kingdom in Calabar and the Igala Kingdom, which opposed Aro's growing influence. But most significantly, the mid-19th century saw the actual stamping out of the slave trade in Africa. The slave trade was abolished in the British Empire in 1807, one of the first formal acts of abolition. Other countries followed suit shortly after, but the transatlantic slave trade did not end immediately. From 1808 to the 1860s, British ships patrolled the West African coast to intercept slave ships. The British were zealous in their attempt to end the slave trade, I guess because it was evil, but it also helped that British Caribbean plantations were becoming less profitable and needed fewer new slaves. So from the mid-19th century, many of the powerful African kingdoms, whose wealth had depended on the trade in slaves, were in crises. Many of them now tried to turn to trade in mineral and agricultural resources. Fortunately, the Industrial Revolution had resulted in a huge demand for raw materials, especially ivory, rubber, palm oil, cocoa, diamonds, tea, and tin. But unfortunately, the Europeans wanted full control of the now valuable raw materials. In the case of Nigeria, it is at the very least suspicious that most of the so-called punitive expeditions were against rulers who had monopoly over trade in their regions. This monopoly was an inconvenience for the British, and they sought ways to break it, and most of these kingdoms played into their hands. The first colonial claim in Nigeria was Lagos. Under the guise of helping the overthrown king of Lagos, Oba Hakitiye, reclaim his throne from his fiery nephew Oba Kosokor, the British waded into the fight over the throne of Lagos. To justify the attack, they started out claiming Kosokor was the arch-perpetrator of the slave trade in Lagos. The first attempt to depose Kosokor in November 1851 was unsuccessful. Lagos was much better defended than expected. Kosokor had fortified Lagos with a network of barricades and armed his warriors with muskets and cannons. But on Christmas Day of that same year, 3 British warships and 21 smaller armed boats attacked Lagos and relentlessly bombarded it for 2 days. Kosokor's forces were defeated, and the warrior king fled into exile. Akitoye was restored to the throne. He wasted no time signing a treaty that officially abolished the slave trade in Lagos and declared Lagos a free port. From this point, the independence of Lagos existed on paper only. In 1861, Oba Dosemu, Akitoye's son, signed a treaty of cession, and Lagos became a British crown colony and the gateway for British expansion into the region. But Britain's frantic elimination of all obstacles to its imperial ambitions in Nigeria would not come until after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The Berlin Conference was a meeting held by European countries to negotiate and formalize their claims to African territories. It set the rules for ownership of territories on the continent going forward. And from the last decade of the 19th century, the British, bolstered by the decisions of the conference, embarked on military campaigns under the pretext of enforcing treaties or ending slavery and promoting civilization. Let's look at some of these campaigns. The first casualty was the Ijebu Kingdom, one of the Yoruba kingdoms. The Ijebu ruler controlled a key trade route between the interior Yoruba states and the British-controlled port of Lagos. In 1886, the kingdom had been persuaded to sign a treaty that imposed free trade in the region. In 1892, claiming breach of this treaty, the British launched a military campaign to force Ijebu to open their trade routes. The British, led by Sir Gilbert Carter, mobilized a force of about 450 British soldiers and 1,500 Hausa troops, armed with modern weapons, including Maxim machine guns. The decisive battle took place at Yemorji River, where British firepower overwhelmed them. The Ijebu army, numbering around 8,000 warriors, fought fiercely but was outgunned. And after a few weeks of resistance, Ijebu Ode, the kingdom's capital, fell to the British. The British imposed a protectorate over Ijebu, incorporating it into colonial Lagos. This expedition set a precedent for future British military campaigns in Nigeria. By 1893, most of Yorubaland recognized the practical necessity of signing treaties that joined them to the protectorate. The next major military campaign became one of the most talked about, the Benin Punitive Expedition of 1897. As usual, Britain wanted greater control of trade in the Benin region, particularly trade in palm oil and rubber. However, the Obo of Benin, Ovoramwen Norbuse, maintained a strict monopoly over trade in the region. In late 1896, a British delegation attempted to visit Benin City during the Igwe festival. The Obo warned them to stay away as he was forbidden to receive visitors during the festival. When the delegation ignored the Obo's warning, Benin chiefs, suspecting an attack, sent warriors to ambush the British party, killing most of them. This ambush, known then as the Benin Massacre, gave Britain the excuse to launch a full-scale military invasion. In February 1897, a British force of about 1,200 soldiers armed with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery attacked Benin City. The Benin warriors, though brave, were no match for British firepower. After several days of fighting, the city was captured and set on fire. Thousands of priceless Benin bronzes, sculptures, and royal treasures were looted. The Oba of Benin was exiled to Calabar in 1899, and Benin Kingdom was at last under British colonial rule. The looted artifacts remain in European museums till date, sparking modern-day demands for their return. Later in that same year, 1897, the British launched a military campaign against the Nupe Kingdom to secure control of the Niger River trade routes. The Nupe Kingdom, under Emir Abubakar, controlled Jebar and other key territories along the Niger River, while the British, represented by the Royal Niger Company, RNC, wanted control over the area. When the Emir resisted, the British, claiming they were protecting commercial interests and ensuring peace in the region, launched a military expedition to remove the Emir. A British-led force consisting of RNC troops and African mercenaries attacked Jebar and other Nupe strongholds. Equipped with modern firearms and artillery, they quickly overpowered the Nupe warriors, who had mostly traditional weapons. The Emir's forces were defeated, and the British occupied Jebar. With the demise of the Nupe Kingdom, the Niger River became fully open to British trade and administration. Meanwhile, in the southwest, by the last decade of the 19th century, the once powerful Oyo Empire had weakened due to internal conflicts, wars, and external pressures. Ilorin had seceded and most of its vassals had gained their independence. In the late 1890s, British forces had already defeated several Yoruba states, including Ilorin, in 1897, and they sought to establish full control over Yoruba land. With the excuse that Oyo's instability threatened British-controlled Lagos and other Yoruba states, the British forces attacked Oyo using well-trained soldiers and superior firepower, including Maxim guns. The Oyo forces were routed. They occupied Oyo, dismantled its political structure, and established colonial administration. By 1900, the region was fully incorporated into the British Protectorate of southern Nigeria. On the other hand, the British takeover of the Bornu Empire was a long drawn-out affair. In fact, one of the earliest expeditions in the Nigeria region was against the Bornu Empire. In 1893, the British, worried about the presence of the German Empire in the Chad region and seeking to prevent any other European powers from gaining influence in the region, attacked Bornu's capital. And though the British forces were better equipped, they faced stiff resistance from the Bornu forces. It was not until 1900, when the British launched a larger and more coordinated military attack on Bornu, that they were finally able to take complete control of the empire. The opening years of the 20th century saw Britain moving quickly to consolidate its control over the region, beginning with the Emirate of Bida, located in present-day Niger State. As with Jebba, the Bida Emirate controlled a region along the Niger River. The Bida Expedition took place in March 1901. The British forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel H.J. Molesworth, consisted of about 700 soldiers, including African soldiers from other British-controlled parts of Nigeria. The British forces attacked Bida with machine guns and artillery. The Bida forces, although determined, were outmatched by the modern weaponry and military tactics of the British troops. After a brief battle, the British captured the emirate and effectively brought it under their control. In that same 1901, the British forces attacked Arochukwu in present-day Habiha state. They considered the Aro Confederacy a major obstacle to their colonial expansion, and using slavery and human sacrifice as justification, the British embarked on a military campaign that was one of the most heinous of the time. The Aro Confederacy controlled important trade routes, but most importantly, it had a strong religious and political influence over the southeast through the Ibini Hukparbi Oracle, referred to as Long Juju of Arochukwu. And of course, the shrine was located in Arochukwu. The attack began in November 1901, led by Sir Ralph Moore, with about 3,500 British soldiers, African mercenaries, and native allies. The Aro formed alliances with Igbo and Ibibiho groups to resist the assault. As usual, the British forces used modern rifles, artillery, and machine guns, while the Aro warriors fighting with traditional weapons and guerrilla tactics were able to repulse the attack for several months. Arochukwu eventually fell in March 1902. The famous Long Juju shrine was destroyed, and many Aro leaders were captured or killed. This attack marked the final British conquest of southeastern Nigeria. One of the last empires to fall under British control was the Sokoto Caliphate. Unlike most of the other empires that were in decline during this period, the Sokoto Caliphate was young and at the height of its power. The Sokoto Caliphate was founded in 1804 by Usman Dan Fodio, a prominent scholar and Islamic reformer. The establishment of the Caliphate followed a series of religious wars known as the Fulani Jihad. Usman Dan Fodio and his followers sought to establish a state governed by Islamic law. The jihad was successful, and the Sokoto Caliphate became a powerful political and religious entity in West Africa. It influenced the rise of several other Fula jihad states, including the Massina Empire in present-day Mali and the Tukulur Empire that covered Senegal, Guinea, and also part of Mali. Following Usman Dan Fodio's death in 1817, his son, Muhammad Bello, and later his successors, continued to expand the reach of the Caliphate. At its height, the Sokoto state included over 30 different emirates and stretched from modern-day Burkina Faso to Cameroon and covered most of northern Nigeria and southern Niger Republic. The Sokoto Caliphate also became a significant force in regional trade, linking parts of Africa to trans-Saharan routes. In the late 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate faced increasing pressure from the British as they sought to consolidate their control over the whole of Nigeria. The Sultan of Sokoto, Muhammadu Adahiru I, refused to submit to British authority, and in March 1903, British forces, led by Frederick Lugard, advanced towards Sokoto with well-armed soldiers that included African troops recruited from other British territories. The Sultan and his warriors resisted, but they were overwhelmed by the British modern rifles, artillery, and Maxim guns. After a short battle, the British captured Sokoto on March 15, 1903, forcing the Sultan and his followers to flee. This led to one of the most dramatic battles of the colonial era, the Battle of Mbormi. On escaping from Sokoto, Sultan Adahir used the green flag of Islam, which had been recaptured from the British, to rally a resistance force. They regrouped in the walled town of Mbormi, near present-day Gombe. The British forces went after Adahiru and got to the town on the 27th of July, 1903. As they came close to the walls of Mbormi town, the Sokoto forces launched a preemptive attack. As it was later described, suddenly loud war cries were heard and clouds of poisoned arrows rained on the British troops, who were so surprised that they fled. The commanding officer got hit by a poisoned arrow and died within 20 minutes. The fight at Mbormi began at 11 a.m. and lasted till sunset. The Sokoto forces utilized traditional warfare tactics that were initially effective but ultimately insufficient against British superior firepower. Sultan Adahiru and most of his followers were killed, and photographs of decapitated leaders were distributed around the country to convince others of the futility of fighting. The fall of the Sokoto Caliphate marked the end of one of the last major independent African empires in the region. It was a turning point in Nigerian history, as it marked the complete British conquest of the Nigerian region and the beginning of colonial rule in the whole Nigeria. To learn about the Nigeria region before the 16th century, watch my video, History of Nigeria from 11,000 BC to 1500 AD. Thanks for watching.